Well, good morning again, or good afternoon or evening, whenever you're listening and watching this. Today we're going to be reading The Disobedience Zone. This is one of the short stories that I've written, and it's available on Amazon in the Kindle section. The class was having a substitute again. Their teacher, Mrs. Myers, had the flu. Fortunately, their substitute was someone they enjoyed having. His name was Mr. Galeth Lars. There was SOL, Standards of Learning, testing going on, so they had to be extremely quiet. The students didn't like having to be quiet at all, but because this testing was so important, the entire school, even in the hallways and during recess, was on testing conditions, and that meant extra quiet. In most schools, students who do not obey are disciplined by being sent to another teacher's classroom, out into the hallway, or to the principal's office. This school was different from other schools. This school had the DZ. That's the teacher's abbreviation for the Disobedience Zone. Those who refused to obey were still sent to the different places where they are sent in other schools or the office, but at the teacher's discretion, they might randomly end up in the DZ. No one knew what happened to those who were sent to the DZ, but many had their ideas. Today, Marcus, Austin, Julian, JJ, and Sabik were about to find out firsthand. After their morning work was done and they had done all their pledges, the principal, Mrs. Manning, came over the PA system and announced that the school was SOL testing again. Marcus groaned. Mr. Lars, the substitute, cautioned him to be quiet. Marcus just rolled his eyes and groaned again, but then he got quiet. After the class finished the worksheet about sharks, Mr. Miles, the music teacher, came in to have what he called a quiet music class because of the SOL tests being given in the next room. Everything was going as well as it could be expected for a silent music class when Mr. Miles stopped. Marcus and Julian each had just thrown wadded up pieces of paper at Austin. Marcus, Julian, that's your warning. Yours too, Austin. The next time you speak out or act up, you know what happens. His voice got very low and scary sounding. It could be the DZ. Samantha gasped. She could not imagine what would happen to the boys if they ended up in the DZ. She was terrified of the DZ, to put it mildly. Sometimes she even had nightmares about it. Mr. Miles had the class stand for one part of the silent music class. Just as he told the class to sit down, Marcus and Julian reached over their desks and pulled back on Austin and Sabik's chairs. Both boys landed on the floor. Marcus and Julian looked away, the picture of innocence, as JJ, who was right next to Sabik, dumped what was left of his orange juice from breakfast on Sabik's head. The entire class burst into laughter. Sabik was laughing too, as he licked the orange juice off of his face. He was happy to be the center of attention, even if it was the wrong kind of attention. Everyone was laughing, except Mr. Miles. He had momentarily looked down at his computer to prepare the next part of class, which was to play Beethoven's Wig, when it had happened. When he looked up, he didn't yell. He didn't glare. He didn't say anything. He just reached under the top edge of his cart and pressed a hidden button, kind of like the kind that bank tellers use to report a robbery. The 5 boys vanished. The class gasped. Mr. Miles smiled. The 5 boys suddenly found themselves in a strange place next to a raging river. High rocky cliffs towered above them on both sides of the river. The river current was swift, and although it ran silently in places, in others, it was much like the kind of river that people use for whitewater rafting. Large rocks were visible here and there across the river. In several places, the water splashed and crashed against the rocks, creating lots and lots of spray. What just happened? JJ was the first to turn his eyes away from the strange surroundings to look at his classmates. Austin said, "This must be the Disobedience Zone. Doesn't look so bad to me." The others agreed. "It does to me," Sabik muttered. "I don't like this place." "That's because you're a big baby." Julian seemed to enjoy tormenting Sabik in class. Why should it be any different here? At first, Sabik looked like he was going to cry. Then unexpectedly, he turned pale and pointed to something between but behind the boys. Then he just plain started freaking out. "Look at him, Austin. Julian's right. He's a..." Marcus was cut off by a gruff voice coming from the spot where Sabik was pointing. "I am Valdor. You will follow me." They all turned, expecting a very large person from the sound of the voice. What they saw was a very short but wide little man. "Look, a real dwarf," Austin said as he pointed at the creature, laughing as though it were funny. The dwarf was quite wide, but very short, only about 3 feet tall. He wore a loose-fitting, rough brown coat that almost touched the ground and a wide-brimmed floppy hat. His appearance was accented by a jet-black, well-trimmed beard and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through the boys. "I am a dwarf, and you do not know where you are." Valdor spread his short legs apart and crossed his arms as he stared at them. "You're not cool, and I'm not afraid of you." Austin was being really rude. Marcus agreed, "Me either." The other boys said something similar, except Sabik, who whispered, "I am." "Smart boy," Valdor responded with almost a growl. "You are here because you did not listen. You must obey. Follow me." He turned quickly and headed downstream without looking back, as though he fully expected them to follow him. "I'm not going. Are you, Julian?" It was JJ. "He thinks we're going to follow him. I like it right here." "So do I," Sabik said, hoping to seem cool like the other boys. He started to shift his feet to face more toward the river and was shocked to find he could not. "Guys, I can't move my feet." Austin was about to call Sabik a big baby again when he stopped with a horrified look on his face. "I can't either. I'm stuck." His voice got higher in volume as he realized Sabik was right. All of the boys were stuck. One look at their feet explained why. Red quicksand oozed and squished up to their ankles. The more they tried to get free, the worse it got. Now, everyone knows that you should not struggle in quicksand, but these boys didn't. They kept struggling and sinking and seeking deeper and deeper with every wiggle. By the time the boys realized that they were in trouble, Valdor was far down the river, striding along confidently. "Help!" Sabik yelled. No response. Austin joined in and really sounded pitiful. No response. Valdor kept striding ahead as though he could not hear them. Actually, he could not. The boys were beginning to panic big time. They were up to their waists and were getting deeper all the time and more scared all the time. Finally, they got it all together and all screamed at the same time. Valdor heard them. He turned around slowly, but as he realized what had happened, He literally flew back to them faster than it looked possible for his size. Without even breathing hard, he stopped just before the quicksand began and gruffly said, "You must obey. To disobey is dangerous." Reaching into his bag, he pulled out his staff. The stick literally grew in size as he extended it toward the boys. The first one he extended the staff to was Sabik. He pulled on the end of the staff until he was able to get completely out of the quicksand. He sat on the ground on the solid edge, exhausted. One by one, Valdor extended the staff to the other boys, who pulled themselves out of the red quicksand. As they all sat on the solid ground, well away from the red quicksand, they tried to clean off the red mucky stuff, but it didn't work too well. They were still very dirty when Valdor impatiently stared at them and said, "Follow me." He started off downriver once again without looking back, as though he fully expected them to follow him. They did follow for a little while, but in all fairness to the boys, he was going very quickly for a dwarf. As they walked along the edge of the river, trying to follow, at least trying to go the same direction, Marcus saw a fish in the shallow water among some rocks near the edge. When he stopped to look, Austin stopped to look first, and then the others did too. They began to talk and goof around, and then Marcus splashed JJ, and it wasn't long before a full-fledged water fight broke out. Valdor kept going, as though he did not hear them. Maybe he didn't. He never even looked back. Suddenly, a large, scary-looking, reddish-colored fish jumped out of the water and attached itself onto Austin's arm by digging its teeth in. Austin tried to shake it off. It was no good. The fish just dug in deeper than ever with its long, scary teeth. Marcus tried very hard to get it off. JJ and Julian tried too. Sabik was the only one who refused. "I'm not touching that disgusting thing," he said with a slight whimper. No one could get it off. By now, Austin was getting really scared. Marcus was terrified, even though it was not on his arm. Austin was in such pain by this time that he was crying like a baby. Sabik was crying too. They were all so scared that they didn't even take time to tease Sabik about crying. The teeth kept going deeper into Austin's arm every time he tried to shake it off. Now it was not just Austin and Sabik crying. All the boys were crying. Then they began to scream all at the same time. Valdor once again finally heard and turned around. He rapidly returned to where they were. This time, however, he stopped about 15 feet away from them and aimed his upturned wrists at the reddish-colored fish. It was flopping around, and Austin and all the boys were still screaming. Streams of blue light exploded from his upturned wrists and into the disgusting fish. It exploded. Fish guts and fish parts splattered all over the boys. They were really a mess now. Red quicksand still stained their clothing, and now fish guts and fish parts added to their appearance. Gruffly, Valdor turned away and almost yelled, "You must obey. Now come." Once again, Valdor took off. This time the boys followed for a longer period of time. Finally, "This is boring," Marcus mumbled as he kept on walking. "I'm hungry," Sabik complained, but he kept walking. "You stink," JJ muttered to Julian. "I'm not the only one," Julian answered. "We all stink." They walked obediently behind Valdor for almost 5 minutes, until they saw some stepping stones that looked like they went all the way across the river. Marcus slowed down, looked across the raging river. Then, as Marcus continued to stare at the rocks in the raging river, Austin spoke the words that every third grader hates to hear. "I dare you." Marcus looked at Valdor, who continued to stride confidently ahead, expecting the boys to follow. He knew he wasn't looking, so he jumped onto the first stone. Austin followed. They were all having a great time as they hopped from rock to rock as they went farther and farther from the shore. "Now this is not boring," Marcus said happily. Sabik was the first one to slip. JJ tried to help him, but he slipped too. As the rest of the boys stopped and tried to help, they all slipped and fell into the river and began to bob downstream, gasping for breath, going under, and gasping for breath and going under. Valdor fully expected them to follow and to be following him, so he was not watching when they went bobbing downriver, gasping and screaming. Unable to get his attention, the boys eventually blacked out. When they woke up, it was dark, and they were lying on their backs on the muddy banks of an underground river in a cave lit by reddish light. They could hear voices, and they were seeing things. All around them were reddish-colored snakes, hissing. There were also vicious little creatures the size of groundhogs with long, sharp teeth and big, scary eyes that growled menacingly. Little creatures the size of hummingbirds, but that looked like vultures, buzzed around, snapping sharp teeth as they zoomed in and out. The boys were terrified. Every one of the boys was shaking in terror as they lay there, unable to get up in the sticky, grimy mud. "I can't move," Austin whispered. "Me either," JJ agreed. "I want my mommy," Sabik whimpered. As they lay there paralyzed, they were shocked to see their well-behaved classmate Breezy walking toward them. As she passed them, they reached out to her, but she kept walking as she said, "You should have obeyed." They were getting no sympathy from her. Another well-behaved classmate, Jake, walked up next. He looked right at them as he said, "We're safe. Those things cannot hurt us." Other well-behaved classmates came next. Rosa walked slowly their direction. She shook her head as she said, "You should have obeyed." Elizabeth approached, shook her finger at them as she said, "If you had listened, this would never have happened." Kyra came last. She looked sad, but said without hesitation, "Look at us. We are fine. You are in real trouble because you disobeyed. You must obey." "Help us!" all 5 boys cried out at the same time. Valdor's voice, gruffly and harshly, echoed off the walls of the small cave. "Are you going to obey? Will you do what you are told?" The groundhog things with the sharp teeth and mean, evil eyes were getting closer. The boys could smell them, and it was a horrible smell. The hummingbird-sized vultures zoomed in closer and closer. One of them bit Marcus, and he screamed like a girl. They were beyond terrified. Again, Valdor's voice echoed off the damp cave walls. "Will you obey?" All the boys looked at each other, and together they began to yell, "We will obey! We will obey! We will obey! We will obey!" Suddenly, all 5 boys were back in the classroom. On each face was a kind of dazed look. All 5 were still saying in unison, "We will obey! We will obey!" The girls in the class giggled. The boys laughed out loudly. Mr. Miles just nodded. "I thought so. Works every time." He gathered up his stuff and left. Their substitute just smiled. The end.